Hey, welcome everybody to our PSA online forum. And I'm going to go ahead right away and hand this over to Richard.
Thank you, Amy. I'm very glad to be here under a pseudonym that is my wife's name. Welcome to the PSA Zoom session, Poe Book Show and Tell. Poe would likely have been, I think, very interested. He was certainly a frequenter of bookshops, and Dupin and his companion, the narrator of The Murders in the Rue Morgue, meet in a bookshop. The student in The Raven is seated amongst many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore. And Poe begins his marginalia by writing, "In getting my books," and he wrote in The Philosophy of Furniture regarding an ideal room of shelves holding 200 or 300 magnificently bound books. He was delighted to be asked to furnish an actual private book room. William Gowans, bookseller and tenant in Poe's apartment in 1837, remembered that Poe had a library made up of newspapers, magazines, bound and unbound, with what books had been presented to him from time to time by authors and publishers. What would have been more delightful for him than a meeting to discuss collecting books related to him? We'll have such a meeting at the Poe Conference in Boston in April. Be in touch with Travis Montgomery if you haven't registered yet. But I'm very pleased to have a meeting on Poe book collecting here and now online. Thank you, Amy, for setting this up. We have 5 speakers, 4 on Poe-related books and 1 on Poe-related ephemera. I'll proceed in alphabetical order, introducing each speaker as we go. The chat will be enabled after the talks to facilitate the Q&A, and viewers are welcome to show their own Poe-related books. So let's get started. Stanley Balducci is 71, retired, has a BA in history and a graduate certificate in American history. He's long had an interest in American literature, including Poe. He took 6 credits of Survey of American Literature in the summer of 1977 at his former alma mater, J. Sargent Reynolds Community College in Richmond, Virginia, and he's visited the Poe Museum in his hometown of Richmond 8 times. He will speak this afternoon about a particular Poe anthology. So, Stan, it's all yours. We can't hear you.
Thank you, Richard. Can y'all hear me okay? Okay. This is my Poe book show and tell. This is the text, if you can see it, The Essential Tales and Poems of Edgar A. Poe. This is basically what the back looks like. And if you can see in the spine, it's one of Barnes & Noble's classics with the characteristic gray label at the spine. Okay. Essential Tales and Poems of E.A. Poe is an anthology that contains an exceptionally generous selection of Poe's famous short stories and poems. It is a paperback and is one of the Barnes & Noble's classics with the gray label. These Barnes & Noble classics contain commentaries, endnotes, comments, and discussion questions to ponder and answer. These discussion questions are presented through a variety of viewpoints and produce a better understanding of these enduring works. The text includes a chronology of Poe's life and work, 1809 to 1849. The text Essential Tales and Poems of Edgar A. Poe also includes Poe's only full-length novella, The Narrative of A. Gordon Pym. I acquired this text about 2018 because I wanted to read further about Poe's works, and this book seemed to be so complete. Professor Fisher's 42-page introduction contains a scholarly analysis about Poe and his works, more so than most other books, it seems. Barnes & Noble Classics still exist today in your local Barnes & Noble bookstore in the fiction section, which is alphabetized by the author's last name. This book, Essential Tales and Poems of Edgar A. Poe, is still in print. Nearly all of Poe's famous works are included in this text, such as The Raven, Annabel Lee, The Cast of Amontillado, Ligeia, and The Pit and the Pendulum. Other of Poe's lesser known tales are also included in this text, such as Bon Bon and King Pest. Poe was a master of detection and terror and was dubbed the founding father of the modern detective story by author Conan Doyle. In Poe's essential tales and poems are his tales of suspense and detection that show Poe's superb gifts of crime fiction and the macabre, such as in The Purloined Letter and Murders in the Rue Morgue. Poe's masterful short stories are couched in the Gothic vein, which is terror having a gloomy setting, such as a mansion, cellar, or crypt. The editor of Essential Tales and Poems of Edgar A. Poe stated on page XIX in the introduction that Poe carried Gothism to greater psychological heights than most of his predecessors. Poe's famous tales, seen in Essential Tales and Poems of Edgar A. Poe, are filled with such psychological intensity, as in such tales as The Mask of the Red Death and The Telltale Heart. Some details now follow about one of Poe's best horror tales, The Fall of the House of Usher, written 1839, included in this text. As in true of most of Poe's horror tales, The Fall of the House of Usher is set in some unknown place. The owner of the mansion was Roderick Usher, who was so sensitive that everything bothered him, so he lived an existence of reclusiveness inside the Usher house, never venturing forth. His ailing sister Madeline lived there also. Usher suffered from hypochondria and melancholy being a common theme in Poe's writings. The Usher mansion was in disrepair and fungi overspread the whole exterior, indicative of decay. The trees about the Usher house were in decay as well. There was a crack in the Usher house, and a storm in all its fury dealt the Usher mansion a death blow, leaving only rubble and fragments of the once house of Usher. The editor, Benjamin Fisher, includes a detailed introduction and notes to essential tales and poems of this text of Edgar A. Poe. Retired English professor Benjamin Fisher is a longtime scholar of Poe's works. Professor Fisher stated on page XLI of the introduction that Poe's horrors continue to fascinate readers because they touch on timeless existential anxieties common to people everywhere. Essential Tales and Poems of Edgar A. Poe was published in 2004 and sells for about $12, which is a really small cost for such a collection of his famous short stories and poems. I wanted to mention Richmond, Virginia in Poe's time, the 1820s through the 1840s, as Poe grew up in Richmond, Virginia. My hometown of Richmond in Poe's time was characterized by many persons living over their store. Many Richmonders' homes were built of wood and had brick fireplaces. Tobacco and flour were Richmond's two chief primary products produced at that time. Antebellum Richmond's population in 1850 was about 27,000 persons. Poe was editor of the Southern Literary Messenger from 1835 to 1837 that was located at 15th and East Main Streets on the second floor in Richmond, Virginia. When Poe was at the Southern Literary Messenger in Richmond, he wrote Berenice, The Premature Burial, King Pest, and Morella. Poe left the Southern Literary Messenger possibly due to alcohol abuse. Poe had been warned about his drinking before by his boss at the Messenger, Mr. Thomas W. White. In 1915, the Southern Literary Messenger building was razed, but the bricks were saved, and are part of the loggia and walls in the Enchanted Garden of the Poe Museum in downtown Richmond, located at 1914 East Main Street and well worth a visit. The Poe Shrine is at the north end of the Enchanted Garden of the Poe Museum and contains a bust of Poe. The Poe Museum contains a library and a museum of books, antiques, and mementos relating to the famous author Poe. Some concluding remarks about Poe himself. Poe is considered the undisputed master of the American Gothic horror tale. His way with words and creative writings are well known to Poe readers and scholars. However, Poe's alleged drinking problem was probably his undoing. Both Poe's dad, David, and his older brother, William, were alcoholics, so this did not bode well for Poe himself. Also, Poe lost several loved ones early in his life, including his mom, Eliza, when Poe was just 2 years old. A common cause of death in Poe's lifetime was tuberculosis, which took the life of his young mom, Eliza, and some others Poe knew. These losses in Poe's early life no doubt affected him and his work, hence his tales involving woe, bereavement, and melancholy. Unfortunately, despite Poe's literary gifts, Poe struggled with poverty and possibly alcoholism all his life. Poe's personal life could be said to be miserable in some ways, so it is remarkable that Poe was able to write such creative tales and poems. It is also remarkable that Poe produced such creative works in just his 20s and 30s. Many people do not reach their potential until later in life, perhaps their 50s or 60s. It has been said that Poe, like other highly gifted persons, had a mercurial temperament. Lastly, it can be mentioned that Poe's Gothic tales, while very interesting, do not always make for pleasant reading, as the themes of grief, loss, and terror permeate throughout Poe's famous short stories. Had Poe lived a full life, there is no telling what further short stories or other his literary genius could have produced. Thank you.
Thank you, Stan. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And thank you for calling attention to that anthology. And the editor, Ben Fisher, was a former president of the Poe Studies Association. In fact, he was president when I first joined. Thanks a lot.
Wow. You're welcome.
So our next speaker will be Barbara Cantalupo. Barbara is Penn State Professor of English, Emerita, and founding and current editor of the Edgar Allan Poe Review, now in its 22nd year. Her monograph, Poe and the Visual Arts, won the PSA's Patrick Quinn Award in 2014. Aside from Poe, her other major scholarly focus is Jewish-American author Emma Wolfe. Cantalupo has reissued 2 of Wolfe's novels, as well as her short stories in the New York magazine, The Smart Set. Recently, Barbara and her husband, Charles, bought a home in Eastport, Maine, the easternmost city in the United States, where she has become totally absorbed in the beauty of the Passamaquoddy Bay. It's as if, as she says, the Richard Wilbur poem, The House, became a reality. Barbara, it's all yours. Barbara.
I have to unmute myself. Okay, I need to share my screen. Amy, may I do that?
It's activated.
Okay, I'll give it a shot here. I'm not, of course, at this point in my own office, so I just thought I'd show you a little picture of what part of my bookshelf looks like. But as Richard said, it's Richard Wilbur's poem, The House, that I'd like to start with. Sometimes, on waking, she would close her eyes for a last look at that white house she knew in sleep alone and held no title to, and had not entered yet for all her size. What did she tell me of that house of hers? White gatepost, terrace, fanlight of the door, a widow's walk above the bouldered shore, salt winds that ruffle the surrounding firs. Is she now there, wherever there may be? Only a foolish man would hope to find that haven fashioned by her dreaming mind. Night after night, my love, I put to sea. And this poem, of course, immediately brought to mind the last stanza of Annabel Lee. For the moon never beams without bringing me dreams of the beautiful Annabel Lee. And the stars never rise, but I feel the bright eyes of the beautiful Annabel Lee. And so all the night tide, I lie down by the side of my darling, my life and my bride, in her sepulcher there by the sea, in her tomb by the sounding sea. Now you may wonder, why did I start with Richard Wilbur? Well, partly it's because of this book, which he signed for me in 2003 when I interviewed him for the Poe Review. And that's a photo I took of him in his study with his, and you can see in the right corner, his manual typewriter with which he wrote letters, one of
Barbara,
which.
sorry
Yes?
to interrupt. We can't see your pictures, unfortunately, yet.
What?
Maybe you'll try again. So sorry.
Oh my goodness, wonder why that is. View.
Yeah.
You must not be sharing yet.
Yeah,
No.
it didn't come through yet that it was sharing, and didn't want to get too far in before I.
Yeah, thank you. I certainly wanted people to see what I was doing here. How do I do it? I just put it up, right?
There's a little place at the bottom menu that comes up if you put your cursor for share screen. And if you click on that, you'll be able to choose what we can see.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No
Forgot.
problem. There, it's coming. Beautiful. Now we see it. Now we see it.
So I will want to view it as a slideshow.
Got it. And
Okay, there we go. There's the Poe bookshelf that I mentioned. Sorry.
no,
Thank
I'm going to mute so you don't hear me now.
And there is the poem, and there's the Annabel Lee. Okay, so now you can see what I'm talking about in the Laurel Poetry Series book that Richard Wilbur signed for me. As you can see, it's also a note because I asked him to write a blurb for Poe in the Visual Arts, and he was kind enough to agree to do so. And quite honestly, it was a beautiful tribute on the back of the book for those people who have seen it. This edition, the Laurel Poetry edition, is very special to me, as are the letters. He's a poet I admire so much, and I found his graciousness just amazing. He's a very generous, gracious man. Okay, and the next book has a story. I don't have it with me because it was too heavy to bring to Maine, but it's the prologue, which I didn't have for many, many years. But when Burton Pollen died, I inherited tons of his books and papers. And this copy of the prologue is obviously very special since it was signed by both of the authors. And I also have one from Eric Carlson. So I have two prologues now, which is hard to believe because when I first started when I was first hired actually at Penn State Du Bois, Richard was instrumental in that process since he was interviewing people. In any case, I was very much a theorist, and I thought to myself, what do you need with a book that goes through every single moment of his life? I mean, why? You know? And now, of course, I value it greatly. So anyway, I thought I'd mention that book in particular, and I'm very grateful for having this edition. The next I have with me, actually, because it's very skinny and not very heavy, it's the facsimile edition of The Murders in the Rue Morgue, which allows me to see, as you can see on the right, I hope, Poe's handwriting and his crossouts, all of that, which of course, would be exceedingly expensive were you to have the original. It also reminded me of my fascination with the Poe show that was at the Morgan, at the Morgan Library many years ago, for which I wrote a review, and was astounded by the small, like long piece of paper that he would write things on, very tiny handwriting. So I very much appreciate this particular edition of Murders in the Rue Morgue. In the back of it is a letter that he wrote, and also very special is the kind of facsimile picture of his signature, which I think is, kind of nice to see. And obviously not only for rich people who have a lot of money who can own that sort of thing. So it's nice to have the facsimile. So that's number 3. Now, number 4 is not actually a Poe book, but the cover is Martini's picture of Poe. And his emotional, hold on a second. Whoever is down there, could you go away? I'm living in a house in which I have a study that's kind of open to others. Anyway, Martini, Italian artist. I got this book, inherited this book from Burton Pollan, and I think his imagery of Poe is so, emotional, as are his various editions, illustrations of all of the stories that he illustrated between 1905 and 1908, sorry, although there's one there later on. Martini produced 132 illustrations for the stories of Edgar Allan Poe. This I find very fascinating because, again, it's not what we think of when we see the static images of the raven sitting on the bust of Pallas. It's an emotional sense about the bird itself and not necessarily the narrator of the raven. The kind of tortured emotional state that this imagery of the raven demonstrates is much different than many of the artists who have done this poem, and obviously there are many. This one is kind of a sort of basic image of the Cask of Amontillado, but I liked the idea that he took the time to put the trowel in there with the little warning, and also the kind of natural looking eyes and portraiture. This, of course, the gold bug imagery with the skeletons, it only enhances in the glaring kind of gaudy eyes on the actual bug itself. And the skeletons are almost laughing. It's a very, I think, a very astute. And this, I think, is the best. This image of Usher is incredibly emotional, and in my mind, the kind of depiction of Roderick that the story does portray, but Martini really got to it, in my humble opinion, especially since the eyes are encased in almost a skeleton-like frame. William Wilson also, again, is a very sort of straightforward demonstration of his ability to render, but it also, the kind of skepticism and anger expressed in both images fascinated me. Silence of Fable, a story I wrote about a long time ago. This image, again, is such a haunting, emotional, not particularly representative of the feeling and silence of fable. And this, of course, is the book I would love to own, which is Albert Martini's illustrations of Edgar Allan Poe, including the one from Pym. So if anyone ever finds this and wants to, throw it my way, I'd be happy for it. Anyway, I'm just teasing, of course. I'm sure it costs lots of money. And that is the end of my presentation.
Thank you so much, Barbara. Those were some great images to share. And it's good to be reminded of Richard Wilbur and Burton Pollen, who were such major contributors to Poe studies, and David K. Jackson too. So thanks so much, Barbara. Our next speaker is David.
You need to stop unsharing your screen, Barbara.
Yeah, just hit stop share.
Sorry.
Perfect. Yeah, perfect. We're ready for David.
We're back. We're
Yep.
back. Very good.
That's
David Cody is professor of English at Hartwick College. He received his BA from Tufts University and his PhD from Brown University. His interests range from 17th century British to 19th century American and British literature and culture, and his articles, essays, reviews, and book chapters on various subjects have appeared in many scholarly journals, books, and annual volumes. He serves on the editorial boards of several journals, including the Edgar Allan Poe Review. This afternoon, he will speak on some quaint and curious Poe ephemera. Welcome, David.
I too forgot to unmute for a moment there, sorry. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to be a little more formal than would normally be the case because I'm talking about a very small object, but I got so interested in it that ended up involving a lot of names and dates that I couldn't commit to memory. So I'm going to ramble along here and periodically maybe ask Amy to move a slide along for me and so on. So my first thought after encountering Professor Kopley's proposal for today's program was what a wonderful idea. A chance for a brief respite and or surcease of sorrow, if not a metaphorical quaffing of nepenthe during what would undoubtedly turn out to be a sufficiently grim, COVID-oppressed and somewhat bleak November. My second thought was, what, if anything, might I possibly be able to contribute to such an enterprise? And a subsequent brief mental inventory of my holdings left me feeling rather glum. For a really serious Poe collector, the sort that Barbara was referencing a few moments ago, possesses deep pockets, great scholarly acumen, a tenacious memory, and, if at all possible, a time machine of some sort. And since I lack all of these things and attributes, my own collection, and I'm using air quotes, is very much a haphazard thing of serendipitously acquired rags and patches, most of which a true collector, I think, would deem peripheral or ancillary because they pre or post date Poe's brief lifetime or are connected to him only at second or even third hand. I have to say that many of the objects that have given me the most pleasure in the acquisition, runs of Graham's and the Southern Literary Messenger, a copy of the 1884 Doré Elephant Folio edition of The Raven, a vellum-bound set of the 1894 Stone and Kimball edition of The Works, the 1930 Lakeside Press W.A. Dwiggins illustrated edition of The Tales, and so on. None of these are particularly rare, and they'd be familiar to my audience. Others, though less common, might also seem less interesting because they're more obscure. A bound annual volume of the Boston Emerald for 1806, Mary Gove Nichols's Reminiscences in the Sixpenny Magazine for 1863, Poesque manuscripts by Francis Saltus, a copy of Daniel Frederick McMartin's Poe Besotted 30 Years in Hell or Confessions of a Drug Fiend, and so on. In the end, therefore, I decided to advocate on behalf of a diminutive bit of ephemera, well aware that in the company of the stellar objects around it, it would appear like the faintest star in the Pleiades, barely visible and then only obliquely to the naked eye. Might seem to be, as Emily Dickinson once put it, the only kangaroo among the beauty. I present it, however, in the hope that it may serve as a reminder of the extent to which our collective attempt to understand Poe's life, works, and legacy may sometimes be furthered by insights garnered from such obscure, overlooked, and apparently insignificant objects. So we can go to the first slide, if you would, please. Yeah. The object in question is a printed program recording the performance on April 28, 1902 of two brief one-act plays, The Devil and the Philosopher and Twilight. Twilight, though it was written by one Henry Swears, who was, one assumes, a distant relative of Toby Dammit, is not otherwise Poe related, and we may safely ignore it here, very much as history itself seems to have done. Hugh Stokes's The Devil and the Philosopher, on the other hand, was, as the program informs us, an episode based on a tale by Poe. My students call this story Bonbon. In France, of course, they would call it Bonbon, but I'll go with Bonbon for the duration here. So this play is based on Poe's tale Bonbon, although the title is not mentioned. A glance, you can move on to maybe another slide or two, if you would. A glance at the cast of characters reveals too that the adapter made rather free with his material. So what was almost certainly the first and for many years the last performance of a theatrical version of Poe's already self-consciously theatrical tale took place at the Trafalgar Studios in London, then and for many years after a favorite haunt of young and talented artists of all sorts. At one time or another, George Williscroft Reed, Edward Gordon Craig, Frank Brangwyn, Evelyn de Morgan, and Mervyn Peake were all residents there. The set for the play was designed by one such artist, Leighton Woad, and another, J. Alfonso Toft, appeared in the role of Bonbon. While the distinguished Herbert Granville Fell not only played the part of the devil, but also provided the artwork that we see on the program's cover. What the program offers then is both a tantalizing glimpse of a forgotten play based upon a work by Poe and a previously unknown illustration, Fell's only venture apparently into Poe territory, depicting characters from the same work. The original manuscript of this never printed and only once performed play has been lost, and this appears to be the only surviving copy of the program. A souvenir that has managed to escape the wreck of time only, one assumes, because it bears Fell's autograph and those of several other then prominent actors and members of the audience. All that we know of the performance itself derives from two brief reviews in the art record for May and the Playgoer for September of 1902. According to the former, the exceedingly dramatic, fantastic episode benefited from intricate lighting effects of an order of excellence not often found in amateur theatricals, and the performance was received with great favor by a large assemblage. The Playgoer noted that Poe's philosopher, a drunken, superstitious, and would-be skeptical publican, was admirably played by Mr. Toft, and that Mr. Fell's devil was a fine and forcible contrast to the more subtle art of Mr. Toft. Bonbon has not often been illustrated, and of the few attempts that have been made, the best, I think, is F.S. Coburn's, which predates Fell's by a year and is, unlike Fell's, clearly based on a careful reading of the original text. I put this slide at the very end by mistake, so you have to zoom through a bunch of other things that I'll come back to just in a moment. And at the end, you can see what I think is a wonderful illustration by Coburn right here of Bonbon. This is one of the few illustrations for this story that I think really captures something, what they would call unheimlich about the entire business. Fell, who actually did the illustration on the cover of the program, was an important artist in his day, best known for his illustrations for poems by W.B. Yeats, the Book of Job, the Song of Solomon, Book of Dragons, wonder stories from Herodotus, serious poems of Thomas Hood, and Hawthorne's Tanglewood Tales and a Wonder Book. All of those were published between 1896 and 1903. He was also very well known for his work as editor, art critic, and book designer. He designed book plates, excuse me, book covers, and papers, and so on. While this previously unknown depiction of the devil and the philosopher was preceded by the images in W. Heath Robinson's 1901 edition of Poe's poems, it may be thought of as a harbinger of the coming flood of works by talented artists such as Byam Shaw, Edmund Dulac, Harry Clarke, Arthur Rackham, and other fantasists who would soon create what now in retrospect seems a golden age of British Poe illustration. So is it possible to go back to the end of the program thing? So all I did here was throw in a bunch of other, there's the first Bon, first actor who portrayed Bon, J. Alfonso. This is the 8 Henry Swears' play, which we can forget about because I looked it up and it's terrible. The one that should have survived didn't, and the one that did survive, no one is ever going to read again in all of human history. So, and the rest of these images are just fell illustrations. This is a book plate. He did book bindings, vellum book bindings, and then he illustrated a number of really interesting books in a kind of late pre-Raphaelite style. So the only surviving copy of the program, long story short, has this wonderful, he clearly didn't read Poe's story, but it's got a devil and a philosopher on it. And it's a minor contribution to, art based on Poe's works that nobody's ever really noticed before. So that's my story. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, David, for making ephemera endure. That's great. We have as our next speaker, John Gruser. John is a former PSA president, author of the award-winning Edgar Allan Poe and His 19th Century American Counterparts, which was published by Bloomsbury in 2019. And he's a senior research scholar at Sam Houston State University. John has published a dozen essays about Poe. This presentation draws on 2 of these: his piece on detective fiction in the 2020 collection Anthologizing Poe, and The Gold Bug, Reading and Race in the forthcoming Retrospective Poe. Earlier this year, Broadview Press brought out a critical edition of Pauline Hopkins' novel Hagar's Daughter that he edited with Alicia Knight. And next year, Oxford University will publish A Literary Life of Sutton E. Griggs, the man on the firing line. And Texas A&M University Press will issue the essay collection Animals in the American Classics, How Natural History Inspired Great Fiction. Along with Norlisha Crawford, he is currently editing African American Writers Respond to Poe, a Poe Studies special feature to appear in 2023. So, John, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Richard. Here are the books. I don't know how well you can see them. This is Monsieur Dupin. There's nothing on the front and the back, but there's something on the spine. And then this is the Rand McNally Canterbury Classic, The Gold Bug. So let me dive right in. The delayed, but by the end of the 19th century, unstoppable recognition of Poe as a major writer with a profound, sustained influence abroad and at home coincided with and contributed to the coalescing of detection into a discrete literary genre meriting its own anthologies. In volume 3 of the works of Edgar Allan Poe, that was 1894 and 95, Edmund Clarence Stedman and George Edward Woodbury published The Gold Bug, The 3 Dupin Tales, and Thou Art the Man together under the heading Tales of Ratiocination. And Stedman's memoir in volume 1 ascribes the founding of detection to Poe. A decade later, in 1904, McClure, Phillips and Company brought out Monsieur Dupin, the detective tales of Edgar Allan Poe, with the same selections as those appearing in Stedman and Woodbury's edition of works, accompanied by 8 illustrations by Charles Raymond Macaulay and a 12-page introduction by McClure's literary advisor, William S. Benwell Bradley. The introduction to Monsieur Dupin deserves to be better known because of when it appeared and what it says about Poe and detection. Bradley distinguishes Poe's tales from crime stories that preceded them and describes the means by which he wrote them. Unlike the tales that appeared in Blackwood's magazine in which the revelation of the guilty person typically relies on, quote, some strange accident or coincidence, some quasi-supernatural agency of nature or of conscience, wherein one seemed to detect the hand of God, unquote. Poe's tales highlight ratiocination. Elaborating on Poe's methodology in composing his detection, Bradley states, quote, in reverse order, he would, failing an actual case, premise a set of clues and then proceed to induce from them, working backwards, a complete and elaborate fiction of his own invention. He had then only to eliminate the intermediate stages in the process in order to have in all its essentials the basis of the modern detective story, unquote. Although the observation that Poe wrote his detective stories backwards, a notion that the author himself hints at in his August 1846 letter to Philip Pendleton Cook, would become a commonplace in criticism on the genre, it is worth noting that Bradley was apparently the first person to state it explicitly in print and to connect it with the method of ratio required of the detective tale. Concentrating on the trilogy, Bradley asserts that Poe's primary purpose was to create in Japan a character who should embody in its highest degree the power of the human intellect to proceed from the slightest clues and the faintest prominences above the plane of the ordinary, to use his own, Poe's own phrase, to the penetration of the most remote and baffling mystery. And that's a quotation for Bradley. Bradley reserves his highest praise for the Purloined Letter, the, quote, masterpiece of the series, which has indeed, and with reason, been called the best detective story ever written. The finality is less an essay in inductive analysis and more of a story than either of the others. And it succeeds because the solution is reached by means that are really startling in their ease, simplicity, and naturalness, unquote. Bradley concludes with a discussion of Poe's considerable influence on modern literature generally, and detection in particular. And in doing so, he places detective fiction among the established contemporary literary genres. He claims with incredible prescience that they all owe to Poe, quote, more than will ever be realized until the history of our age has been completely written 100 years hence, unquote. In view of what he calls this larger indebtedness of the whole of the art of our time to Poe's genius, Bradley observes, quote, the fact of his having originated the form of the detective story seems a matter of relatively slight significance, unquote. However, he does not fail to note that the genre has entered the modern canon. Quote, the persistence of the form throughout a century and the vitality which it still exhibits in our own day prove its right to be regarded as one of the types of modern literature, unquote. Bradley's high praise of Poe reflects a change in attitudes that was in full swing during the early 1900s. After decades of mixed feelings about the writer and his legacy, scholars and the general public in the United States embraced Poe at the start of the 20th century, initiating a love affair that has grown exponentially ever since. And Amy, maybe if you could at this point, just kind of scroll through the first 5 images. Okay, the first one, that's the frontispiece, and that is Dupin and the narrator walking through the streets of Paris. That is Dupin on the right and the narrator on the left, and you'll see that the narrator looks just like Poe. In the other images, Macaulay puts an emphasis on spectatorship. So here is the sailor looking through the window at the horror in the room, the ape, and what the ape has done to the 2 women. And then if we move on to the next image, Amy, it's kind of like a bookend image of the previous one. This is the group of people in the Rue Morgue bursting into the room and their horror as they observe what's happened. The last 2 images that I'll show of Macaulay are from The Gold Bug. This is Legrand looking at the parchment. And again, you can see he looks very much like Poe. And then the final one is Legrand accosting Jupiter for confusing his right with his left. Okay, I'm going to go on and talk about the second book now, the Canterbury Classics edition of The Gold Bug. Selling for between 25 and 45 cents, the Canterbury Classics, published by Rand McNally, were small hardcover books intended for classroom use. The introduction to the series was written by Kathleen Lee Baker, professor of literature at Wellesley College, advocate for social justice and world peace, and author of young adult fiction and the famous poem turned hymn, America the Beautiful. In the introduction, she states that the series, quote, is addressed to children and aims to stimulate imagination, broaden sympathy, and awaken a love for literature, unquote. And she stresses the cultural work performed by the volumes, referring to Americans as a practical people in a practical age who, quote, need the grace of fable to balance our fact, the joy of poetry to leaven our prose, something the sort we are bound to have. And if familiarity in childhood with the classic tone has not armed us against the cheap, the flimsy, the corrupt in fiction, we fall easy victims to the trash of the hour, unquote. The Gold Bug was part of this project, and Theda Gildemeister, a professor for over 30 years at the State Normal School in Monona, Minnesota, now known as State University, edited that volume, which was published in 1902. Interspersed throughout the text of the story are 7 illustrations by Gustavus C. Whitney that are captioned with language from the tale. Whitney, who would later do some of the artwork for Cream of Wheat advertisements featuring the black cook Rastus, a name derived from minstrel shows, obscures Jupiter's visage in each of the 4 images in which all 3 characters appear. And Amy, if you could go to the first one. In the first, the faces of the narrator who is holding the parchment and Legrand are illuminated, while Jupiter stands in the darkness with only his eyes visible. In the second, Amy, in which the trio set out to hunt for the treasure, the faces of the 2 white characters can clearly be seen, but again, Jupiter cannot. In the third, Amy, Jupiter holds the lantern for the narrator and Legrand as they dig for the treasure chest, illuminating the white men while he is a barely discernible silhouette. In the last of these images, the white characters sit at a table inventorying the treasure. Meanwhile, Jupiter stands behind the narrator with his countenance once more blocked from our view. It would be hard to imagine illustrations of Poe's story that more clearly reflect Toni Morrison's ideas about the shadowy presence of Africanist characters in white American literature than these. In another image, in which Jupiter is the only person present, if you go to the last one, Whitney depicts his face clearly for the only time, but draws on minstrelsy in doing so, portraying him with wide open eyes and a fearful expression as he sees the skull on the branch of the tulip tree. Taken together, Whitney's renderings of Jupiter convey the message that Black people are less important than whites, are loyal to the whites they serve, and are prone to excessive emotion and comical superstitiousness. In contrast, his white characters appear significant, serious, highly competent, and in the case of Legrand, brilliant. To extend a term Terence Wayland uses to characterize the beliefs of the time in which Poe wrote, parts of both Gildemeister's reading list and her suggestions to teachers attest to the average racism of her own era. She divides the former into 10 sections, one of which is showing Negro fidelity, courage, etc. In this section, Gildemeister recommends writers, quote, whose work portrayed the devotion of Negroes after freedom to their former owners, or the attractive features of Negro characters in general, unquote. These include the leading plantation school figures, Thomas Nelson Page and Joel Chandler Harris, along with George Washington Cable and several local color writers who've long been forgotten. Each of the writers in their bibliography is white. For today's reader, the language section of Gildemeister's suggestions to teachers proves to be the most eye-opening of the entire book. She contends, quote, Poe thoroughly understood the character of the Southern Negro, so that a detailed study of Jupiter, as here represented, will help to an appreciation of all Southern stories in which the old-time darky figures. Abandoning the quotation marks immediately thereafter, she goes on to say in discussing Southern hospitality, quote, most darkies make good cooks, unquote. In particular, the following statement deserves analysis. Quote, "It is like an easygoing darky to talk upon many unrelated topics and waste much precious time before reaching the important part of his errand, namely the delivery of the letter. We see again the antebellum days when time was not so carefully counted as it is today," unquote. Gildemeister appears to be drawing a contrast between her own time, Bates's practical age, and the one in which Poe's story was written and set, especially with her use of the past tense, when time was not so carefully counted. Yet with each of her assertions about people of African descent, these are written in the present tense. Negroes are natural imitators. Black people are cautious, superstitious, loyal, and, quote, "love to belong to a well-to-do massa," unquote. Overall, she contends that whereas the United States has changed greatly since the antebellum era, its Black population has not. Failing to accurately and responsibly contextualize the racial content of the Gold Bug, featuring Whitney's images that obscure or ridicule Jupiter, offering a list of readings about African Americans composed entirely of white authors, most of them from the plantation school, and making sweeping generalizations about Black people peppered with offensive references to them. Gildemeister's 1902 classroom edition of the story Poe wrote in 1842 provides clear evidence that it was in fact the average racism of American society that continued unabated over that 60-year period. Although the Civil War ended slavery decades earlier, depictions of African Americans, including those by textbooks editors, perpetuated white supremacist beliefs by emphasizing Black people's supposed inferiority. In other words, editions such as Gildemeister's implied that the United States had made great strides since Poe's day, while African Americans had not changed. And I hope to have shown what in fact had remained static was average racism. White America continued to believe in the supposed authenticity of Poe's depiction of Jupiter, which had been reinforced by ongoing minstrel stereotypes and more recent plantation fiction. Through her classroom edition of The Gold Bug, particularly its suggestion for teachers, the normal school instructor Gildemeister reinforced a set of ideas about race that had held sway since Poe's day, and the teachers whom she influenced, in turn, inculcated the same ideas into the minds of her students. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John, for that very good talk about images of detection and images of race in the Gold Bug, and your analysis of Gildemeister's text on those images. Very good. Thank you so much. So we will close out our speakers with Jeffrey A. Savoy. Jeffrey A. Savoy is an independent scholar, long and closely associated with the Edgar Allan Poe Society of Baltimore. He is also an honorary member of the Poe Studies Association. As the co-editor of the Collected Letters of Edgar Allan Poe, 2008, the standard edition of Poe's correspondence, and the author of dozens of articles published chiefly in the Edgar Allan Poe Review and Poe Studies Dark Romanticism, he has deeply explored various aspects of Poe's life and his writings. He is also the driving force behind the well-regarded website of the Poe Society, eapoe.org. Jeff, I'm happy to have you contribute your show and tell.
Okay. I am unmuted, right? People
Yes.
can hear me. So, for whatever reason, I don't seem to be showing up on the screen prominently. Can I be spotlighted or something?
In my view, I've got you prominently.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, it should work for the video.
Just the weirdness of how it looks to me, then, I guess. So I have been collecting Poe's works for about 40 years. In addition to early editions, those that I can actually afford, I'm particularly interested in the history of Poe editions, the history of Poe scholarship. My collection, of course, does not hold a candle to Susan Taine's, but I am rather proud of it in my own dim, shadowy way. So I'm going to show some of the editions. I particularly like to get editions that show how the evolution of collections of Poe's works are put together and how they evolve, and books that have associations or special connections. And again, I'm interested in the history of Poe scholarship. Makes me kind of a Poe groupie, I suppose. I'm going to be moving my camera around. I hope no one's going to get seasick from this, but we'll see how this works. So first, a non-book item, if I can be forgiven for stretching it a little bit. This is a photograph of Sarah Sigourney Rice. She was the Baltimore school teacher who basically ran the movement to put the monument over Poe's remains now at Fayette and Green Street in Baltimore. So I'm interested in that, particularly for the obvious Baltimore connection. It's a two-sided photograph. There's a different picture of her on the back. And I'm sure this was very fashionable writing gear at the time. This actually belonged to her family. It was given to me by her great niece, who was a very good friend of my mother's. And this is a Poe bronze. It was done about 1898. I have occasionally seen drawings of the design. This is the only actual copy of the bronze I have ever seen. It shows Poe in what is supposed to be his West Point coat. The drawings show that there was actually supposed to be a raven here, but it doesn't look like anything has ever been broken off. And it may have been that when they did the bronze, they decided that it was too impractical, and so they didn't actually do it. David Cody mentioned this first set, which is this is the Stedman Woodbury set. This is in the vellum. As he says, it's not a terribly uncommon set, although this is a fairly nice copy. Usually the vellum covers are very grubby from handling. What is a little special about this is it has the two separate portfolios of illustrations, which are almost always missing. One is, they're decorated just the same way as the regular bindings. One has the 27, actually it's 23, the 23 reproductions of illustrations taken from the 1884 Quentin edition, which are kind of interesting, but not terribly significant. The ones that are more famous are the only 4 illustrations that Aubrey Beardsley did for the set, which were never included with the set itself, but only available in the portfolio. There's been a lot of misinformation that there were only 25 copies of these done for the Japan paper editions, which were apparently handed out to people who were directly involved with the set. That is not true. They seem to have been available to anybody who bought the large paper edition, which is what this is. But most of them have simply not survived. Now, this rather unimpressive set, this is just an 1876 set of Poe's works, the Griswold edition as printed by Whittleton. What does make it special is it belonged to Edmund Clarence Stedman. There is his book plate. And the poems volume is in particularly sad case because he clearly used it a good deal. One of the things he did in it was to, they had access to the James Lorimer Graham copy of Poe's Raven and Other Poems. And in this, not sure how well you can see that, he actually made his own notations of all of Poe's changes from Poe's copy in his own copy of the set here. And there's a little note at the top that explains that. Let's see. There are also a few markings on some of the other pages where he's marked sections that he thought were of interest or note, or he wanted to make a change or a correction. And he did fold down the dog-eared corners of pages. which is a terrible practice for anyone who actually owns books. So the other thing that's somewhat interesting related to that then is that they didn't really have access to a good copy of Tamerlane. The only copy had been found in 1876 in the British Library. I think eventually they did find an American collector who had a copy, but initially the only thing they really had was the 1884 second edition, so-called, by Richard Hearn Shepherd. But the copy that Woodbury actually used was this. This is Shepherd's own copy prior to the final publication. And it is just full of little markings and annotations and changes, which were finally incorporated in the final edition. So this was sent to Woodbury so that he could get access to the early copies of the poems that were not in the Griswold edition. And let's see. There's a nice little letter here that kind of explains its history. It's a rather shabby looking little book, but not quite worthless to one who likes anything rare and who will value, looks like the manuscript annotations of our friend Woodbury. And it goes on to talk about it a little bit. So I just like the fact that here are two things that were actually used in putting together that edition. So when Ingram was looking for people to help him with his research, he was in England, so he couldn't really do a lot of research here in the United States. His Baltimore connection was William Hand Brown, who was a librarian at Johns Hopkins. So this is the 2-volume 1880 biography of Poe. And this copy was signed by Ingram to William Hand Brown, June 1880. That's a nice association copy, not only Ingram, but another Baltimore connection since Brown was here. Interestingly, when he retired, he moved to Warren Road, which was very close to where the Carroll and Brooke Pierce used to live. And then when he did the 1-volume edition, he sent another copy. Again, this is William Hand Brown's little sort of book plate. It just says the gift of the author, which is not particularly auspicious way of inscribing it. But what is mostly interesting about it is there are a couple of little notes, but the primary one is in the back. You can sort of see it at least. Brown is the one who made the copy of the Joseph Walker note that was sent to Dr. Snodgrass when Poe was found at Ryan's Fourth Ward Tavern, and eventually sent to, well, the name of the institution is very complicated, but we'll say Church Home Hospital because that's what most people remember it as being in later years, at least. The original note is long gone. It survives in 2 transcripts that Brown made, one that he made and sent to Ingram, and the other right here in the back of his copy of the biography. Since the original note has never been found, that makes these, I think, in a way, very significant. Again, very nice as a Baltimore connection. These are not quite as special, but this is the 4-volume set that the other volumes that Ingram did 1874. What is unusual and nice about these, again, with my interest in Poe editions, is this is the only copy of the set I have ever seen that has the little publication tabs in the front that indicate that the volume 3 will be published next month. So we actually have an idea of when the individual volumes, because it's hard to think about it now, but all of these sets were issued, the big sets were issued in separate runs, volume at a time, couple volumes at a time, because they were very expensive to produce. The Griswold set, that's not really the case, but for the others, it is. And this is a copy of Whitty's 1917 edition of Poe's poems. And this is a copy that was given to George Woodbury. It has a very nice letter to Woodbury in the front, signed by Whitty. So again, it's just sort of a nice association copy. There isn't any significant information there particularly. And then one little last one I will grab here. Many people are familiar with the 1917 edition of Poe's poems by Killis Campbell, but most of what we're looking at are actually the later editions. They don't have the date on the title page. It's only on the copyright. But if you read the notes of your copy, if you happen to have one, you will probably see that many of the notes refer to works that were printed in 1925. Clearly not the 1917 edition, referring to things not printed yet for several more years. This is the actual first edition. This is a copy presented to a friend who also taught at the University of Texas. And it is actually the first printing of the 1917 edition. So when I did it for the website, I did put the original text and I tried to differentiate what was added for the later editions. So they're both there, and you can sort of see how he changed it. There's actually a very interesting correspondence with Whitty at Duke University, another kind of war. Whitty was furious at Campbell for daring to come up with a competing edition of Poe's poems and tried to suppress it. And one of the reasons I think that Campbell came out with the later edition, and there's so many more copies of the later printing, is because he made revisions to try to mollify Whitty, which of course didn't work because Whitty was not about to be mollified. He didn't want the competition. So I hope that's interesting. And that's sort of my little show.
Thanks so much, Jeff, for that tour of your treasure trove. That was great. Well, at this point, I think we're going to open the chat and open things to everybody. Questions, comments, perhaps people want to show their own Poe items. Please feel free to offer your thoughts.
I'd like to say something about that note that that Joseph Walker sent to Snodgrass. I learned that Snodgrass had moved to West Virginia. He actually was from West Virginia, and by 1880 he had returned to West Virginia to live there. And he took his collection with him, and the collection of letters and that note actually went to West Virginia, and that's where it was when it was found. Actually, it wasn't in Baltimore. All that material was actually in West Virginia. So when it became lost, it might have been during the time it was sent to the Sun Papers reporter. I think his name was Carpenter, and then supposedly he sent it back to Walker's wife, Walker's widow, and it might have got lost on the way back to West Virginia.
Didn't know that. Great, thank you.
It's actually a little horrifying when you look into some of this, how much what we would consider certainly incredibly rare Poe material was sent back and forth, sometimes across the continents, and much of it was either not returned or was lost or was damaged. Sarah Helen Whitman sent a manuscript poem to be photographed, and the guy lost it. So it's amazing that anything's really survived. I was going to thinking of manuscripts. Barbara was showing the facsimile, The Murders in the Rue Morgue manuscript, as a small note, since I have handled the original manuscript in my very own hands. The facsimile does not reproduce every aspect of that manuscript. It's not only slightly reduced. In the original, several of the pages have little flaps that cover some text. Because Poe was pasting the thing together, I guess, and revising and cutting sections out and putting it back together again. So all of that text is again reproduced on the website. And although it's really neat to be able to see a facsimile of Poe's handwriting, as I said, the original manuscript does have material that is not, you couldn't reproduce in the facsimile. You would have to have had the flaps and everything, which a couple of things did. The Fantasy Pieces 1928 facsimile was done, has little slips of paper and things added in, but that was a very extravagant facsimile. I also thought for the Martini illustrations, one of those, the round one, reminded me of the M.C. Escher self-portrait in the sphere, which is very interesting looking.
Richard, this is Alex. Just a general question for the panel. And feeling my mortality, what kinds of arrangements and thoughts do people have about their ownings when the time comes from them to shift off the mortal coil? How do you handle that, and what kind of arrangements, if any, do you have beyond mine, which is largely denial?
Great question. I'll let the speaker speak.
Oh, I just know that I was very lucky to have received books that from, for example, Burton Pollen, that would have gone to Goodwill. All of his papers would have gone to Salvation Army or thrown away. Same with Eric Carlson. His books just would have been sent to Salvation, and they don't even want books, Salvation Army. So God knows what they do with them. So, I mean, you're right. You do have to, I mean, clearly both, well, Burton in particular did give his books to libraries, the ones that he felt were most valuable. And that makes sense before he died, you know, clearly. But there was no provision with his children, and similarly, I'm sure with Eric Carlson's family, what to do with it. You know, that even a note would have been helpful, except, you know, you're right. We do have to think about it, especially people with value. I mean, I don't have, what I have is pretty much what I got along with the things that I bought on my own, but you know, it's a treasure to me. It would be a treasure to other post scholars to get that kind of thing, but you certainly have to do something, and I don't know what to offer otherwise, but I just wanted you to know that story, that things would have just gone in the trash if you don't do something about it.
Thanks.
Other thoughts? Well, one thing I understand is that increasingly institutions are requiring not only the book collection, but also an endowment to care for the book collection. So it's become more and more difficult to figure out a way to have an institution care for a collection.
Right.
Alternative, of course, is to have a book dealer sell it, or have an auctioneer put it up for auction. It's a tough one.
I will say as a small note, the witty copy that went to Woodbury was actually given to a library, and they apparently turned around and sold it. They kept it, they had it on the shelves for a while because there's a book plate of the school's library in the front cover of it, but they turned around and sold it. And unfortunately, that seems to have happened with a lot of collections. If people get duplicates and that sort of thing, I see my collection particularly being supportive documentation and material for the website. But at the moment, the website is what I do. I've not found any institution particularly interested in hosting or supporting the website. I'm not sure where it will go. It's an even bigger question when I am unable to maintain it. I do send backups to the Mabbitt collection at the University of Iowa. I think I would probably ask them first if they wanted or would take some of the material that does support it. Outside of that, I don't know. I guess it will have to go the route of the auction block, where it will not get all that much money probably. And again, when you send things, H. Bradley Martin, with the big stuff went to the auction, but people don't always realize this. There was a ton of lesser material, sometimes secondary or third copies, that went just to bookstores. there was actually briefly a glut on the market of copies of the Tales of the Grotesque and Arabesque because he must have had over a dozen of them. And I bought one of them. Fortunately, I bought it at that time because I couldn't touch one now. I mean, they're outrageously expensive. And I bought copies of books from William Self's collection. I couldn't have bought anything at his auction. That was insane. So these things do go out, and they don't necessarily just go on the auction block. They do go through book collectors. Some collectors, Self, wanted his stuff to be sold because he liked the idea that other collectors would be able to buy and own it. But I've assembled a particular nature of stuff, and I kind of like a large part of it, at least, to stay together. As I get, again, as I said, it really does support the website. If it starts getting spread apart, you lose that continuity of showing the evolution of this edition became this edition, this biography was revised and became this biography. That whole history gets lost if you don't actually have the assemblage.
Bill.
Yes, I was just going to say to those of you listening and viewing today, first, thank you also presenters. For those of you who have not been to the Huntington Library, I was delighted and surprised at the extensive Poe holdings they had there, all well documented, and even boxes of things and the mementos, things you would expect to see. But I think that would be a place that has other supplementary materials if y'all wanted to, individuals wanted to donate their collections or aspects, or even offer for sale based on whatever an appraiser might be saying for the Huntington to purchase. That's an idea. I think any place where scholars such as myself can go work and have access to these collections, they'll arrange them in a place like the Huntington. I know the Houghton has some Poe things as well, as does the Lilly Library in Indiana, again, as many of you probably know. But I think you're right, you can't just donate your books places now. They want some sort of endowment for preservation unless they have already set up something.
I have a couple of things that I would probably try to send to the Harry Ransom Center.
Yes.
I have William Kester's set of Graham's magazines. I'm sure they have another one of his sets as well, but I have the sets that were shown at the Pratt Library in 1935. They even have the little display cards that went with them when they exhibited that. And I have Kester's copy of the Ostrom letters where he's marked in a red pen all the letters that he actually owned. I'm not sure why that didn't go with the collection. They might be interested in that, but I mean, that's a small particular thing. And I don't know that they would be as interested in the other items. Again, I'm sure they have better copies of most of those things.
I'll just throw out the fact that in the Oxford Poe, in the I think it's in Scott and Tara's introduction to that, they do worry, in fact, about the website in part. And I both, and frankly, my thought is the PSA has got a kind of a continuity and even funds. I just think of it in terms of if there's any piece of this discussion that might be worth it thinking about, sorry to sell this, is maybe making sure that the website, whatever it's supported by, has got real continuity. Not that I think of you as not immortal, Jeff, but
I don't think of myself as immortal, but I mean, I do send, as I said, I send backup copies to the Mabbott collection. No one should have to start from scratch if they ever have to rebuild something like the website. But that, I mean, the backup copies just go out there on CDR, and they're supposed to keep all of them. So if one fails, there's an older backup, which won't be quite as up to date, but it's still better than going back to nothing. But even institutions, it's a tricky thing. Jerry Kennedy was talking about, well, it would be safer in an institution, but I know plenty of people who had pet projects at various institutions of various kinds, not necessarily Poe related. And as soon as they no longer had an active member of the faculty advocating for that project, it got deleted from the servers. So institutions are not necessarily keepers for eternity anymore. They're not really that interested in it. They kind of want whatever is hot and sexy, and I mean, they're sort of satisfying faculty requests and student research projects. But it's just like libraries. I mean, some libraries don't even have books anymore.
Right.
David's hand's been up, Richard.
Oh,
I would just add in response to the original question that it's rare, but there are book collectors who at some point, at some stage, realize that they had more fun collecting than they get out of possessing the objects, and they actually sell off their own collections in part so they can watch other people have the joy of, if they're concerned about family members and children and grandchildren and that sort of thing, that comes into play. And at the other extreme, I always remember what happened to Herman Melville's library, which his wife sent off in cartloads to a Manhattan book dealer, and in some cases, annotated copies of amazing Melville books sat on the shelves there for decades. But aside from fires and floods and wars and disasters, a lot of these things resurface at some point. So maybe that lost Poe letter will show up on eBay at some point. Never know.
Richard,
yes.
I have a couple of items, Poe-related items that people might like to see. This is an 1848 edition of Fanny Osgood's poems. It was published shortly before her death, and it's in great shape. I've got the gilt leaves, the gilt is still on the leaf edges, and there's this great frontispiece in the Clark and Austin series.
Mm-hmm.
This is from that age when bookmaking was an art. And here's another. This is a collection of Sarah Helen Whitman's poems. And there's this beautiful gilt-tooled nosegay on the cover. It's absolutely beautiful. This was published a year after her death, but some of these things are actually relatively accessible online. I know that I was able to find mine by combing through Abe Books for a few years, and things cropped up that looked like they were worth purchasing, and I was pleased with them. But some of these books as material objects are just absolutely marvelous, and to experience them the way that 19th century readers would have is a delight.
I agree.
Somebody put a comment in the chat of that they expected that internet has hurt bookstores, which would be less likely to appraise old books than they used to be. But it's also really helped. I mean, I have found a lot of things through ABE books, although, and I haven't seen all that special on eBay recently. Over the years, particularly when it first kind of started, I got some really nice things on eBay, and I was outbid on some really nice things on eBay. It is amazing what turns up on eBay. Susan Taines actually bought a couple of original Poe letters off of eBay. Haven't seen them for a while.
You're the one who's been outbidding me. I can tell.
I hope so. I've been outbid. I particularly despise snipers who come in the last 2 seconds, and they do it through automated.
I hate that.
So you've been sitting on something that's been going all week for like $5, and suddenly in the last 2 minutes, it goes up over hundreds of dollars and well beyond your high bid. I hate that.
Could I just mention one more thing? This is just serendipity, but this is an eBay thing. Just last week, I bought a ledger from it must have been a kind of general store / pharmacy in Batavia, New York, but it was run by the Griswold family. And there's a whole page of Rufus Wilmot Griswold's purchases, 1845, 6, 7, 8, I think. He was borrowing money from his relatives, among other things. And it just popped up on eBay, and sat there. Nobody was interested. And it was very inexpensive, but it's mostly to do with his brother and his uncle and his nephew, but there's some of the bad Rufus there. So I was tickled.
Nice, very nice. I heard a talk earlier today in which a bookseller said the internet has been extremely helpful to collectors and extremely harmful to book dealers.
That sort of depends where the book dealers lived, though. I mean, if they were in a little outback, they've been able to get higher prices. But if you're in New York or Boston, yeah, you've had to bring your prices down to meet everybody else.
Yeah.
Do we have time maybe for one more question? I see Amy nodding, thumbs up. So somebody take a shot. No? Okay.
I hope everybody appreciates how rare those Aubrey Beardsley plates that Jeffrey was showing are. Those are really, really hard to find because, as he said, they almost always disappeared.
And I have 2 sets.
Well, that's very impressive.
Wow.
But yes, they are unusual. I actually also have, they were reprinted in 1901 and 1903 in a sort of larger format. And those are almost as scarce, and I have both of those also. So again, a case where I think the accumulation is sometimes more interesting even than the individual, because you really do see the history of things, and it gets broken apart if you sell them. Even at auction, they don't always necessarily put things together that really should be together, because they want to sell each individual item and get as much money as they can for it.
Yeah.
I have a final question, if I may. It's very
Okay.
short. It's just, do you, for all the presenters, I loved very much, but I have a simple and silly question. Do you actually read on those books, or they just stay like for part of a collection?
I use mine for the website all the time.
That's great. That's good to know, because when I'm reading the website, I'm always trying to imagine the physical book. So it's great to know. Thank
Well,
you.
I just did, for example, 2 slightly interesting examples. I was just doing one, and I was looking initially, I had printed off the pages of Graham's magazine for the Imp of the Perverse from Google Books, because it was a nice, easy copy to work that way. And there was a T missing from pregnant. It just kind of dropped off the page. So I went and checked my original copies of Graham's magazine, and they have the T, but you can see that it's beginning to wander. So that's a case where, the T really belongs on it. It wasn't missing. It wasn't a typesetting error. It just got dropped off in some copies. So I had to go back to my originals to see that. What was in Google Books is not the only one. The AMS reprint of the Broadway Journal has a couple of spots where it looks like there's an extra period or a comma, and it's just a printing error. It's not. I have an original set of the Broadway Journal, not with the very rare last issue, but a decent set. And I had to check the originals of that, and it's not there. It's only in the AMS reprint. So reprints sometimes can cause troubles if you don't go back to an original.
Thank you.
Well, I'm going to say thank you to all of you for coming. I hope you're able to come to the collecting session at the Poe conference on April 7th to 10th. I want to particularly thank our speakers, Stan, Barbara, David, John, and Jeffrey. Thoroughly enjoyed this, and I hope we do it again. Thank you all, and thanks, of course, to Amy.
All right.
Thank you, Richard and